Okay, let's start. Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Welcome to the second webinar in 2022, the BTI Live webinar series. For those of you joining us from the live stream through YouTube or through LinkedIn Live and are not familiar with the accelerator, BioTools Innovator is in its second year now. We're an accelerator program and competition powered by MedTech Innovator, and the first accelerator to support the growth and the success of life science tools and diagnostic startups, developing novel technologies to support human health and to improve human health. We are, as I said, in our second year of operation and very proud to support 14 amazing innovators and technologies. To learn more about them, you can always visit our website, biotoolsinnovator.org, and to learn more both about our program, but also about the amazing technologies that we are working with. Our summer webinar series, as I said, this is our second live stream, both on LinkedIn and on YouTube. You're welcome to join us if you're part of this industry and interested in what's going on. In our webinar series, we bring together industry leaders to talk about current thoughts, current challenges, and just interesting trends and developments within the industry. And today is definitely no different. I'm honored to have with us and present today not one, but two partners at DeciBio. DeciBio is the leading research tools and diagnostics, market intelligence, and consulting company. And today with us, we have Stefan Woodell. He's a founding partner at DeciBio. Hi, Stefan, and thank you so much for joining us. And Miguel Edwards, he's also recently became a partner at DeciBio and as a market research and market intelligence expert. Hi, Miguel, thank you. So without further ado, really the most interesting things we are going to talk about today is what Miguel and Stefan has to tell you. And we're going to talk about how to identify beachhead opportunities for novel technologies within that industry. It is no small feat for any of our companies, because these platforms are, interestingly so, can do many, many things and be applicable to multiple markets. And so I will let you two kick it off. And thank you again.
Thanks for the intro. So what we're going to be doing today, as Ayelet mentioned, is going through a quick introduction of DeciBio, so you get a sense of what we do and who we are. Then we'll be going really quickly through something we call like market research 101 to make sure that we perfectly align in terms of what we consider market research, the terms that we use. And finally, what we'll do is we'll be talking about how to identify these beachhead opportunities. Miguel and I do a lot of work in this industry, so I'll be walking us through this presentation, and then I really wanted him to join us for the Q&A, which is frankly going to be a good half of this presentation today. So without further ado, let me just go through this presentation, starting with the brief introduction of DeciBio. As Ayelet mentioned, our mission is to provide a strategic insight to accelerate the adoption of precision medicine technologies. We work with a battery of large companies such as Thermo Fisher, Illumina, and Foundation Medicine, and then smaller companies, including startup. Actually, at times we take convertible notes to have these companies do some project that would be larger than they can chew on otherwise. The one thing that's different about DeciBio compared to other consulting firms is that we actually have three different arms. Like, we are a strategy consulting firm first, but we also have an analytics division, which is actually about 20% of what we do. And then we have this DeciBio Ventures, which takes multiple form. And so at times we actually write checks, or as I mentioned, take equity as a form of payment for some of the companies that we work with. In terms of our services and capabilities, we work with tools companies, diagnostic companies, but also some digital health companies, and finally pharma that comes to us, especially because they want to understand how to understand the technologies, essentially, as opposed to the drugs themselves. Although interestingly enough, now with gene and cell therapy, the technology is the therapy, and as a result, we're doing more and more work in the gene and cell therapy space, looking at the drugs themselves. One of the things that this is a meme that we love at the company is that I believe that historically you had this precision medicine revolution has been giving a lot of credit to pharma, and tools and diagnostic hasn't getting a ton of credit at all. And that's something that we believe is unfair and that is about to change. And at its core, at DeciBio, we do believe that the precision medicine revolution is going to be driven by tools and diagnostic as opposed to biopharma company. And just to exemplify that quickly on this slide, what you can see if you look at the patient journey in oncology, that's always screening and early detection and diagnosis, treatment, and monitoring. Diagnosis obviously plays a role across the patient journey as opposed to the drugs that play a role like in the second half. On the left-hand side here, what you can see is that essentially the prognosis for a cancer patient really ties much more to the stage of diagnosis than it does to the therapy that they're under. So if you find cancer in prostate, breast, or bowel at a time where it's localized, your survival, 5-year survival is actually pretty good. And what happened is that as soon as it starts to metastasize, this is when it becomes actually really aggressive and really deadly, right? Within the case of lung cancer, I believe only 4% of patients are still alive after 5 years. Now, looking at lung cancer again, and now on the right-hand side of that graph, what you can see is that Jim Allison received a Nobel Prize a few years ago for essentially discovering that PD-L1 inhibitors could be used in order to activate the immune system to attack this cancer cell. And like that was such a big deal, and it's led to Keytruda and a bunch of drugs that have been frankly quite revolutionary in some cases. But when you look at the actual Kaplan-Meier's curve of this patient, the reality is that you can just extend their lives, a year or two post compared to the standard of care, which was I think on this slide chemo. So the bottom line is that you really want to be on the left side of that graph as opposed to the right side, right? And the technology can help you capture and find cancer early as opposed to later. And again, this is an example in oncology, but we believe that this is going to be true across therapeutic areas. So as I said, this is for the intro of the firm and what we do, why we do what we do. In terms of Market Research 101, the goal here, we're going to be sharing these slides with you, so we will be flying through them, is that the way that you conduct market research is by doing so by using secondary and primary research. Primary research is conducting interviews or focus groups or conducting a surveys or even observing people if you go into a lab and try to see what they do and how they behave, as opposed to secondary research which relies on things that have already been done, that have been published, such as a 10K for a company, for example. It's important also to understand the difference between a market size and a SAM and a TAM. The market size is really today, what is the total revenues of the company that participate in a space, and how does it actually segment by competitor, for example. In contrast, the serviceable addressable market, or SAM and TAM, are how big the market could be. So for example, if you have only like 100,000 cancer patients that actually get tested using next-gen sequencing, but the incidence of cancer is, let's say, 1.6 or 1.8 million patients, then your penetration currently would be like something in the 5% range. Market growth is self-explanatory, and as we said, it's very important to actually understand market segmentation, and we will be talking about that some more as we evaluate what are the best options for beachhead opportunity for your technology. This is just a slide that, again, you can review on your own time, that gives some of the advantages and disadvantages of primary versus secondary research. Obviously, secondary research tend to scale pretty well. A couple of like sources that we use in order to find some of this secondary research as well. And finally, the approach that we have to try to connect with key opinion leaders. Like the reality is that they can be pretty expensive. If you call from a startup and you ask for advice, sometimes they'd be willing to take the call for free if it's a short call. If not, you may want to pay these people up to $1,000 an hour for some of them, if not north of them. There is a couple of points we wanted to make in terms of consideration for disruptive technologies, which might be the case for a number of companies that are on this call today. And so I think that it's important, especially for disruptive technology, to understand like how they actually are positioned on a specific map. And it's especially important also for them to identify these beachhead opportunities, because a lot of time it's almost like you get a better tool for pretty much everything. So let's spend a bit of time like talking about this disruptive tech. So for example, here on that graph, what you can see, it's a 2x2 that shows on the y-axis like the accessibility of data, and on the x-axis, the relevance to human physiology. And so you see that essentially the genomics tools tend to be like all the way on the top left. Like the data is highly accessible, but it's not as relevant to human physiology, except maybe in the case of cancer, when the link between genotype and phenotype in cancer tends to be like a straight line. That's really one of the reasons why precision medicine is really still very much like in oncology as opposed to other diseases, is that when you have a T790M mutation in the EGFR gene, you're going to have resistance to a drug like erlotinib. It's like this one SNP gives you resistance to that drug, and with specific clinical outcome for the patient. As you move actually further right, though, it tends to become like a better set of tools in order to really characterize the physiology of a patient, right? Because there are a lot of examples where people would have mutations, but the cancer doesn't necessarily develop. So the closer you get to the actual phenotype, the closer you are to actually being able to map to what is like the clinical presentation or outcome for a patient. What's interesting on that slide here is that a lot of time, like when you look at, for example, as a tool like proteomics, you can actually try to see what it takes in order to increase accessibility of the technology and try to see what it needs to in order to increase its relevance. So for example, in the case of proteomics text, what we have here is that to increase accessibility, you're going to have to improve the technology, maybe improve the plex, decrease the cost per data point. And in order to increase the relevance to human physiology, you're actually going to have better analytics. Interestingly, it's not always the analytics that push you to the right. In some cases, like in the case of phenomics, the analytics actually push you up and actually like increase the accessibility of the platform. So this is just yet another example of like some of the interesting companies that we've come across and work with over the years. And as you can see, it's actually very important to actually think about what are like the right metrics in order to position your company on a map, right? And in this case, your goal should always be to be in the top right corner. So try to think about like as you actually position your company and present it to both customers and present it to investors, as what are some of the two significant axes that I can put on a graph that enables me to put myself on the top right. So for example, here, if you have to work with like quantum SI, you can say like, well, they have a really high plex, they can actually sequence amino acids. And so like the granularity you can do in order to identify, let's say like, proteins or peptide is really high. And there is like other like type of dimensions that is interesting, which is, again, this is like a sequencing platform. This is not like simply just doing peptide identification. It actually can tell you what are like the amino acids that are present. There is another graph that I think a lot of people can use, and that is very interesting. It's looking at the adoption life cycle for technology. In this case, we have as an example like a genomics technology. So you may have seen like this graph and this bell curve in the past. So you have essentially the early innovators, who typically are about like 2.5% of the market. The early adopters are like 13.5%, early majority plus 34%, that gets you half. And then you have the late majority and the laggers. What's interesting here, and what we want people to keep in mind, is that when you actually think about what is the focus of these different technologies and what it takes in order to cross the chasm, it actually really takes going from being a simple technology to actually having this application. So a lot of time, if you want your technology to actually gain traction, you have to demonstrate that there is a specific use case or an application that you can use this for, which is better than anything that's currently available or just completely novel, right? What's interesting is that like, as you actually want to go towards the second half, it becomes less around the application because that's been actually pretty well demonstrated and established. And it becomes actually much more about workflow and cost for people to be able to adopt that. Then you can actually see what is like a relative importance that we have here attributed to different things, such as finding the application, the actual workflow, the data analytics, the cost, and what is the level of sophistication of the users. There's a lot of companies that tend to be very proud about the fact that they've managed to place an instrument at the Broad or MD Anderson or the Mayo Clinic. But the reality is that like a lot of time, it's actually relatively straightforward to place an instrument at these places, because it's in some sense like their role and their job to be kicking the tires on these technologies. And so what it means is that what's much more impressive to investors is not that you've placed a box at the Broad, but that you've actually already have a sense of what are some of the key applications that your box can you use to, and that unlock new markets. So something to really keep in mind. The last piece that we have here all the way at the bottom is the type of customers that you can go after. So again, in the early stage, the innovators tend to be at academic medical centers. Then you can actually go after like top universities, followed by biopharma and clinical and applied markets. What's interesting here is that there are a handful of exceptions where biopharma is actually the early adopter, where they will be adopting the box almost at the same time as the AMCs. And you've seen that, for example, in the case of spatial biology. What's happening with companies like NanoString or like 10x Genomics is that the value proposition of the box that they have for translational research is so high that it really enables you to understand the tumor microenvironment, that biopharma has been actually really rapid to adopt these boxes, also in part because like the cost per sample is high, and as a result, even AMCs tend to be a little bit more careful about adopting the box. I don't want to say randomly, but for applications that are not as well, established or for in use cases that might not necessarily justify the high price. The last one that I'll make here, and then I think that we'll finally move on to the meat of the presentation about Beachhead assessment opportunity, is that a lot of people ask us like, well, how is it that I can actually try to identify how to unlock a new market if I have a disruptive technology, something that is essentially creating some market expansion as opposed to a market conversion, right? Sometimes you can convert the market by just looking at like what is the current size of the market and just taking share from a current competitor. And sometimes you just completely unlock something novel. So for example, in the case of next-gen sequencing, it's an interesting use case where we essentially sequence the human genome. It costs like $3 billion in order to do that over like 2 decades. And then comes next-gen sequencing, when you can actually now sequence a genome not in a decade or not in years, but essentially in weeks. And you can do so for like initially hundreds of thousands of dollars and tens of thousands of dollars. And now people are talking about the $100 genome, which is going to be right here, like essentially within like probably a year or so, maybe 2 at most. So what we did here is like, if you look at NIH funding using the term genomics, you see that there's been like this massive increase in funding as soon as the 454 and the Solexa box, which is now Illumina, actually launched, because they essentially unlocked this new market. So if you can try to find a way or a good proxy of this is what happened in terms of that funding for that part of an organization, whether it's in biopharma, whether it's like looking at grants, it's something that can be very interesting for you to actually make the case about how a new technology can actually unlock part of a market. All right. So the way that we wanted to do this presentation in terms of the Beachhead opportunity assessment is first by talking a bit about where it fits within the strategy framework. And then what we'll do is we'll look at like 3 use cases, or let's say like 2.5. We have 2 use cases, and then just the last one to make a single point about the importance to have a good target product profile. So the way that we think about strategy at DeciBio is as followed. Like if you think of it as, it's very important to actually look at this graph and always read essentially from left to right. You need to start with what's the mission of your company, right? And then once you have the mission, you need to have a couple of goals in order to actually be able to execute on that missions. Each of the goals now, moving on to the right, has to be supported by strategies, okay? Each of the strategies by tactics, and each of the tactics can be actually measured by Kpis and metrics, right? Kpis is simply a term for key performance indicator, which is typically a ratio of 2 types of metrics that you have, something that's a bit more insightful than a simple data point. What's very important here, again, is to never actually try to retrofit tactics into strategy. And we see small companies do that all the time, that they have an in for something. And so as a result, they actually use some of the end that they have to something in order to retrofit like that into a strategy. And sometimes it's okay. For example, if you've developed a box and you are a cardiovascular researcher and you have access to like 100,000 samples from a specific niche cardiovascular disease, it can actually become part of your strategy, because this access and differentiated proprietary access to the database is very valuable. And in that case, it would be part of the strategy as opposed to the tactic. But in some other cases, we would see people actually try to retrofit things that they know they can do, and it becomes core to the strategy. And this is not the right way to do it. Again, you want to be moving left to right. Where like the Beachhead opportunity assessment actually falls is essentially right here as part of your strategy. So once you've actually identified your mission and your goals, then you can actually try to think about like what is the strategy in order to do each of these goals, and that includes identifying these Beachhead opportunities. So hopefully that's helpful. Now, there is a couple of additional thoughts that we have on strategy that are, we hope interesting and wanted to share with this group. The first one is that a strategy must really increase the focus that you have and essentially highlight what is it that you can do or that you want to do and what is it that you do not want to do. And this part is just as important. What you say no to is just as important as what you decide to do. So many startups, again, have developed technologies that can address a TAM that would be north of $10 billion. But we often actually recommend companies that they go after a TAM that's actually much narrower. And again, this is where the term beachhead opportunities actually comes from, right? When you look at Facebook, for example, they had developed that tool that they initially essentially launched at Harvard, then Ivy League schools, and then it essentially expanded to all universities and then to everyone and their family pretty much. And this was actually critical in the success of that company to really create this ecosystem that actually gained traction that then just expands. The same is true in biotech. We often say that it's much better to have 10 people at a conference that talk about your technology as opposed to have one person at 10 conferences that is familiar with your technology. The other point about strategy, which is interesting, is that a strategy actually often starts with a challenge. It's typically anchored as a challenge. There is a book we actually read recently called Good Strategy, Bad Strategy. And I thought the book was okay, but there is one point I think that's made in that book that was excellent, which is the importance of anchoring your strategy into an unmet need. That's actually something that is very insightful and very interesting, that if you can't define the challenge that you go after, then it's going to be really hard to come up with a strategy that's defensible. So I would really encourage you all to think through that about what is the real unmet need that we are addressing and that our technology actually addresses. Third point is that a strategy must be cohesive. And a lot of time we see startup actually addressing completely non-synergistic goals. And that's especially true as it relates to the customer type. We've seen companies today, as you'll see, and I think this is the second example that we look at, that was actually evaluating the use of a point of care platform, which was a molecular platform, thinking like a PCR machine, for both ag bio application and then clinical application. And again, it came from the background of the founders. Oh, I know that there is a lot of people at Monsanto who used to do that box for XYZ. And then the other founder being more around, well, I think it'd be very interesting for the user in infectious disease applications. So this is completely synergical. And so you may want to actually think about what is the first beachhead application you want to go after, and how can you actually build a menu around that initial beachhead application. And again, we'll be talking about this some more. And finally, the thing that's interesting about a strategy and that people don't necessarily realize is that there is an element of uncertainty or risk around a strategy. This is not just simply planning, right? Is that if you think of planning, you just have a checkbox, and it actually ties much more to tactics. But strategy, you essentially have to take a bet about something that you think is going to happen in the future, and that is actually quite uncertain. And you have to have that core belief. And that it's not necessary, but it's something that we've seen a lot of companies actually do successfully. So on the right-hand side, I'm not going to go through the details here, but we give you an example about how some of these insight actually maps to the way Decibel has designed their own strategy, because we are a strategy consulting firm, so we actually thought through this, but we have a focus on precision medicine. We have consulting data and venture for a number of reasons. We offer data product, and we actually tend to actually work with only a subset of clients as opposed to a broader set. So the next thing that we wanted to go through with you are some of the key questions that we help founders actually typically address whenever they come to us with questions around how do I identify a beachhead opportunity? So this is something that you don't need a consulting firm to work with. This is something that you can do on your own. This is something that you can also do by using a freelancer. If you have someone in a space that is now a free agent, that person would have recently maybe sold her company, you can actually work with that person in order to try to identify what might be the beachhead opportunity and help you actually build the commercial operation of your company. So one of the first question or high-level bullet points here is, what are some of the top applications that your new technology could initially address as beachhead opportunities, right? So you want to identify the list of top application of interest based on what are some of the initial publications, if you have any, and based on discussion with other industry KOLs. When you talk to people, who gets excited and what do people do with that technology, right? And try to create a list that is relatively exhaustive. You can have like this funnel approach. Once you have that list of hopefully a couple dozen applications, what you can do is try to think about what are the factors and attributes that should be taken into consideration when you select the best opportunity. And we actually, as we go through these use cases, the select cases we'll go through, you'll see that we have a couple of examples of what these things can be. This attribute can be, the fit of your technology, the willingness to pay of the customer, that type of questions. How does your technology map to user selection criteria by application? So for example, you may have a technology that has really low throughput, but it has like really high plex and really low cost. So who are the customers who actually care about the cost and plex? So essentially, what is like the technology that has the best fit based on the use cases? You also want to understand what applications require consistent use of your technology. Sometimes you have a technology that is like the perfect fit for something, but then it would be a use case where people use the technology as a one-off and then they stop. So obviously this is not good. You want them to actually be using it in production mode, something where it's actually used relatively constantly in a perfect world. And then you want to understand how some of the beachhead opportunities that you looked at can be mapped to the most valuable application and the competitive landscape. It's possible that like the perfect fit is actually going after a player that is extremely established and that's likely to defend its position really aggressively. So for example, if you had a sequencer and you were to try to go after Illumina's oncology business, it'd be quite difficult because this is like an important business for them. And as you can imagine, they're going to be trying to defend it aggressively. The second set of questions is just as important. It's also to try to understand the locus of users and key opinion leaders in each of these applications. Okay, so KOL stands for key opinion leader. And then try to understand how do these key users compare? Is there a clear preference among users for specific applications, for specific equipment? Try to understand who are like the influential KOLs and how you could actually engage them in order to gain credibility in your platform. If you can get 2 or 3 people, sometimes it's enough, like if they have a big enough megaphone in order for them to be publishing the work and be presenting it at conferences in a way that helps you gain traction. And you can think about ways that you can actually get them engaged, right? You can actually send them a box for free. You can actually try to have them pay for the box, but have a partnership where you actually have them run the samples, or you can run the samples for them when they ship you the samples and you run them in your own lab. You can actually ask them to join your board of advisors. So there is like different ways that they can be engaged. You can also think about like what is the natural next moves, and that's something else that's important. Like as you select these KOLs and they tell you like this is like the first application I'm going to use this for, they should be able to actually tell you like this is what I actually want to be doing next with that technology, so that you can start to think about what's going to be the right menu strategy. Again, something we'll talk about in a bit. And so the bottom line is that you want to try to build and roll out a cohesive set of applications that maximize success. It's not just like, oh, you know what, we're going to place the first box in a bunch of clinical customers, and then you have to completely rebuild the install base in order to have your second asset in launching on a box. In terms of business model, it's also important to understand what is the relative attractiveness of various business models. I'm gonna maybe, before we looked at this bullet, tell you like a story that's actually quite interesting of 2 companies that were competing in a space that became really hot. And what happened is that the company that was first to market is the one that actually ended up losing. And the reason that they lost is because the second company actually managed to run and compete as a service, as opposed to actually selling a box. And when you actually offer this as a service, knowing that you're going to sell a box eventually, but you don't have time to actually get to market soon enough, it actually gives you a chance to your customers to be using your technology without taking too much of a risk and committing to the box. So thinking about the business model about like, is it going to be product only? Is it going to be service initially when you actually transition to product afterward? It's actually very important. So you want to be thinking about like, how does a potential high volume model map to the application? You want to think about how much you should actually charge for the device and for the consumable. Like a lot of time, as you probably know, the margins on the device are much lower than they are on a consumable, because you want people to adopt the box and then you make money on the juice. It's this razor blade model. And you want to try to understand the price sensitivity of customers. A lot of times they're actually cliffs where, for example, in order to get, I can't remember the letter of the grant, there's something like a S1 grant or something like this from NIH. you actually the cutoff are like 75K and 250K or something like that. So it would be probably a bad idea to be like pricing your instrument at 80K if they are very specific price points like this, where it changes the way people can actually charge for what you offer. You also want to think about what are some of the key programs and initiatives that can serve as catalysts for some of what you're doing. And so, for example, if you think of a company like Olink, I think they've been actually really smart at finding a way to actually position their box as part of some of these population studies. And so, again, this is something where you have like a lot of samples, and you can actually start to build a story about like what is the value of this information when it's actually being used at scale. You want to think about what are some of the alternative business model that can be used. Like fee for service, economy pricing, premium pricing, et cetera, et cetera. All right, I'm going to do a quick time check. And as I said, over the next 15 minutes or so, we're going to be looking at like 3 use cases. So the first use case, if I can actually try to get this to go away, which I can't, which is fine. So the first use case here is, interestingly enough, was for an instrument, which is this point of care molecular instrument that I had mentioned earlier. So the way that we actually helped this company think through this, and that was actually part of the proposal, that was not part of the case itself, was to think about like who are the potential customers. Are they going to be in developed countries or developing countries, right? You have like a PCR box. It could be used like in Africa for TB, for example, or do you want to be like in developed countries? Do you want it to be clinical customers or non-clinical customers? Again, it can be used in ag bio, for food safety, for animal health, et cetera, et cetera. And then among the clinical customers, it can also be used among reference lab, hospital central lab, hospital like point of care labs, or clinics and POLs, which are like the physician office labs, or you could almost even sell the box direct to consumer. And then you can actually try to rank on a scale of 0 to 4 or 1 to 4. How does the attractiveness of each of these segments rank based on a variety of attributes in terms of the need that they have for sensitivity. So reference lab definitely need boxes that have a high sensitivity. Direct to consumer, there is like some of the tests that they sell is just like almost like flipping a coin, frankly. What is the importance of turnaround time? What is the importance of cost per sample, ease of use, et cetera, et cetera. And then the next question that we asked was, again, if you actually decided that you're going to be going for this segment right here, which would be near patient / point of care, or in a clinic and physician office lab, what are some of the key disease areas that you could go after? And the infectious disease area that we evaluated that could be of interest were the hospital-acquired infection, women's health, sexually transmitted disease, and then like some other type of disease. And again, we looked at a variety of factors, just as like market size and growth, sensitivity, turnaround time, and multiplex to try to understand what is the relative attractiveness of these different market segments. We also looked at some other market segments, as you can see here, such as oncology and other type of tests that actually get run. And in the case of oncology, actually, the reality is that you probably don't need the result back that quickly. And there is like some really well-established technology that are going to be really hard, that are really entrenched, and that going to be very hard to displace with a point-of-care instrument. The last point that we want to make here, looking at the menu, is that, as you can see, we had like this, the company already pretty early on, we had them identify what was going to be like the first test that they should launch. And you can see like the test number 1 is right here, right? So like on this axis here, as you actually move away from the bullseye, you're essentially looking at time. And then we said like, well, there is like essentially 4 menu strategy that you can have, and you should be able to actually find a way to name them. If they can't be named, that means that they're probably not really cohesive. So there is probably like a menu strategy, which is around like, oncology, so you can imagine here that first test was maybe HPV. And it's something that was like initially around like infectious disease, and that actually ties into oncology. The second thing that you could go after is actually this pure infectious disease play, right? The third thing you can have is actually go after more like some kind of genotyping applications that ties to, essentially like human health. And finally, you have like a last menu strategy, which would be like, you launch your box to demonstrate that it works, and then you actually completely pivot and start to go after like non-human health. All right, the one where we wanted to spend a bit more time is for this company called NextBio. and so they came to us because they now it's a separate company, second use case. And they came to us because they had developed a novel disruptive proteomics platform, and they wanted to try to understand, what are some of the applications that they should go after. And so one of the key slides that we made for them that helped them actually make that decision was looking at a variety of applications that we actually that we essentially blinded here on this slide. And we actually, for each of the application, look at like how many interviewees out of 25 people that we interviewed actually mentioned that application. What would be the fit of this technology, where people saying like, oh yeah, that'd be a perfect fit of that technology for that application. And what are some of the threats from like the competitive landscape, where like dark red would be like very high competitive intensity. And what are some of the key improvements that you need to do on the box in order for this to be even more attractive? And what was like the total addressable market in 2025? And again, the reason why you would actually want to look at TAM as opposed to market size is if your goal is to actually go out and raise money. Whenever you go out and raise money, yeah, people always want to hear that you're going to go after like a $10 billion TAM. They're like, it's going to be big, right? But the reality is that actually when you think about your strategy, you should be more worried about market size and revenues. If there is a TAM that you have to completely build, it's actually much harder. So again, there's always a difference in tension between what's practical and what is sexy for investors. So again, like I think this is actually was a good example of a very simple framework that helped us rank what was like the increasing fit and attractiveness of different type of application that we recommended that company would consider. And then again, we can just, once you've identified this application, you can try to think about how you actually want to sequence them over time, right? And so what you can see here is just like, you can probably start with, not application number 1, but application number 2. And without getting into details, it was actually more tied to protein identification and quantification. And so that was something that has really broad use case across different stakeholders. There was like a very robust pipeline of academic customers who were excited about it. We thought that this would also generate a bunch of organic data that could get published and could help the company actually gain visibility. And also like the reality is from a workflow perspective, it also made a lot of sense. The second application we recommended was like application number 2. Again, as you can tell, like in terms of fit, this is not a coincidence that the fit of the platform is probably one of the single most important thing that you need to consider as opposed to the TAM. But we made a couple of recommendations around like why they should go after application 1 second, and then like some of these other applications. This is a box that also had the ability to be looking at a pretty comprehensive list of a specific set of post-translational modifications. And so we did recommend that they actually delay, going after that. Although this is something that was actually highly differentiated from that box. This is something that was quite difficult to do, and there would have had to be like a lot of education from the customers in order to actually do that right. Once you've actually identified all of the applications that you want to go after, and I would say our recommendation is to try to avoid going after more than 3, but once in a while, the client is king. And so when they tell you they want 5 applications, then you actually decide what are like the 5, especially when they think they can go after 20, is you want to think about like, well, how many boxes do we think that we can place among each of these customers, and what's going to be the region pull through? And that enables you again to try to think through what's going to be the revenue forecast over time, looking at each of these applications as they come online. This is something that I would say is pretty unique. Like in order to go after so many applications, you have to be extremely well capitalized. And if you have like a lot of money, then you can in some sense afford to do all these things in parallel, especially if you have a pretty well-established commercial team, people who have actually built and exited like, essentially like billion-dollar companies or maybe something shy of it. So anywhere between 100 million and $1 billion, then these people have this experience. You can actually believe that they should be able to actually manage all this workflow in parallel, but it's actually quite challenging. This is just an example of another slide that we put together, and we would encourage you to do the same thing as you think through like each of these applications, is essentially trying to think about a couple of things, right? So again, you replicate that for each of the applications that you have of interest to help communicate, yourself, your team internally, and investors why you're going after these applications. There's something that like people like to hear, and investors, you'd hear them use the term the rules of the game, right? And they want to try to understand what does it take? How are people thinking? What do they care about? And tell us about like what's the game and how is it played and who wins in that game. The second thing is like the competitive intensity, saying like, well, who are you going to go against? Ideally, you'd like to go after like a fragmented market when there isn't like a dominant player who, again, is likely to be aggressively protecting their position. And on the top right corner here, you have like the key technical improvements that you need to do to your box in order to actually be more attractive. So you can see like, you can think about like the different type of specs, about like where is like the current capabilities and where is that you need to be in order to be at the next level. So for example, here in that case, for that application, you can see that our client fell really short in terms of like one specific attribute that people really cared about. And finally, have like in this case, it was like our assessment, like but your own internal assessment of what is it going to take in order for you to address that TAM, and how big is that TAM, and why is that like an attractive opportunity. All right, I think we're making good progress. I believe there is like only one slide left. For the last slide here, what we wanted to discuss is like the importance to putting together a good target product profile. So if you're going to be wanting to assess this beachhead opportunity assessment, you're going to have to talk to people about the box that you have, if it is an instrument, and what is its capability. So here, for example, what we did for one of our other clients, which was in the celomic space, is essentially like look at a variety of criteria, and like including the one that people really cared about, like instrument price per sample, throughput, hands-on time, turnaround time, sample output, a specific rate which we won't disclose, and then the overall the overall like sum of all these criteria. And then we looked at what's the attractiveness on a scale of 1 to 7. It could be 1 to 5, 1 to 7. It has to be a balanced scale. And you can see like what is it that people really care about, and what is some of the commentary that you get from these users and these scientists. And so if you put together this target product profile in a way that's meaningful, I think a lot of time people have a concern about like disclosing too much about what they can do. But the reality is that in some sense, you do have to do that a little bit, or at least, even if you don't want to put like the real numbers, because you think you can sell the box for 50K, but why don't you put 100K down, and people are going to be happy to spend 50, for example. You have to give people something to react to, so that you can actually really, they're going to give you much better answer about which opportunities that you should go after. The more information they give you, the more likely you are to actually get to the right answer. Oh, there was like this one last slide, I believe, and then we're going to be done. So again, ultimately, this does not going to come as a big surprise. Is you want to be going after large markets that are growing. You want to have a high ability to satisfy the key unmet need of your customers and differentiate and essentially position yourself to win. 45 minutes, as promised. So I think this is it for now, and I'm happy to rope in Miguel and answer any question you may have.
All right. Well, first of all, thank you so much. This was highly informative, and I think super relevant and interesting for all of our companies and for other people, in the industry that are watching us, and especially startups thinking about where are they going next. And I'm going to take this opportunity to give our cohort a few minutes to gather their questions. You can either raise your hands or post your questions in the Q&A or chat box. And in this opportunity, I will say goodbye to our viewers on the live stream, both on LinkedIn and YouTube. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to steal one more minute just to say that we're going to be here next Wednesday, same time, same place. We are going to have a live panel talking about strategic partnerships and co-development in the life science tools and diagnostics industry. We're going to be talking to panelists from Danaher, from Thermo Fisher, Agilent, and Nissan Chemical. So do join us and have a great rest of your day. Our cohort and panelists, please stay on, and we will start the Q&A.